Nothing can break you. There is a moment, right before everything changes, when a man does not know if he is about to be destroyed or remade. He cannot tell the difference. From the inside, collapse and transformation feel exactly the same. The chest tightens the same way. The mind goes quiet the same way. The only thing that tells you which one is happening is what you do in the next 60 seconds. Most men never learn this. They spend their whole lives believing that pain is proof they are losing, that pressure is proof they are failing, that the breaking feeling means they are actually breaking. They are wrong. And by the end of this, you will understand why some men walk through fire and come out as something the fire could not touch, while other men with every advantage in the world fold the first time life raises its voice. The difference is not talent. It is not luck. It is not even courage, not in the way you think. The difference is a single idea, buried in the lives of 9 men who were each handed a reason to break completely, and refused. If you want more of this, more of the men who refused to break, more of the philosophy that built unshakable minds across 3,000 years of human history, subscribe to Inner Steel now, because what you are about to hear will change how you carry weight for the rest of your life. Let's begin with a man who had every reason to curse the universe and instead used it to build a system of thought that has outlasted empires. Epictetus was born a slave in the Roman province of Phrygia, sometime around the year 50. He did not choose this. He did not earn it. He was simply born into the worst possible position a human being could occupy in his era, owned by another man, with no legal personhood, no right to his own body, no right to his own time. His name itself, Epictetus, is not even a real name. It means acquired, or gained, a label slaveholders gave to property, not to people. Imagine carrying a name that literally means thing someone else owns. Imagine that being the first fact anyone learns about you. His master, a man named Epaphroditus, was himself a former slave who had risen to serve the Emperor Nero, and like many who have tasted powerlessness, and then gained a sliver of power, he was, by historical account, cruel to those beneath him. At some point, accounts suggest his leg was deliberately broken or twisted by his master, leaving him permanently lame. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his life, a permanent physical reminder stamped onto his body by another man's casual violence. Most people, given this start, born into bondage, physically maimed by the very system meant to control them, would spend their entire life as a study in bitterness. You would understand it. Nobody could blame him. Instead, Epictetus did something almost incomprehensible. While still enslaved, he began attending the lectures of a Stoic philosopher named Musonius Rufus. He was not free to leave whenever he wanted. He was not free to study whenever he wanted. He had to steal moments, steal attention, steal his own education, like a man drinking water through a crack in a wall. And in those stolen moments, he encountered an idea that would become the foundation of everything he later taught, that there exists a line, an absolute and unbreakable line, between the things that are up to us and the things that are not. Your body can be owned. Your leg can be broken. Your freedom can be stripped away by men with more swords than you. But your judgments, your responses, your inner verdict about what any of it means, that, Epictetus insisted, can never be taken, not by any master, not by any chain, not by any law. Think for a moment about the discipline required just to keep showing up to those lectures. He could not simply walk to class whenever inspiration struck him. He had to find the gaps in his master's schedule, the moments he was not being watched or summoned, and pour himself into them. A free man who skips a lecture loses nothing but the lecture. An enslaved man who is caught stealing time for his own education risks punishment on top of the punishment he already lives under every day. Most people, when something costs them that much just to access it, quietly decide it isn't worth the risk and drift back toward whatever is easiest. Epictetus kept going. Year after year, lecture after stolen lecture, he built an internal architecture that his external conditions had no part in constructing and therefore no power to dismantle. Eventually he gained his freedom, likely after Nero's death, and he began to teach. He founded a school in Nicopolis, in northwestern Greece, and his reputation grew so significant that even the future Roman Emperor Hadrian is said to have visited him. A former slave, lame for life from a master's cruelty, becoming a man whose wisdom an emperor sought out. And the wisdom he taught was brutally simple and brutally hard to live. It is not what happens to you that harms you, it is your judgment about what happens to you. A man can take your money. He cannot take your character unless you hand it to him. A man can break your leg. He cannot break your mind unless you let him. Epictetus used to tell his students to imagine that life is like a sea voyage. The ship docks somewhere, and you go ashore to get water. Along the way you might pick up a small shell, a pretty stone. Fine, enjoy it. But always, he said, keep one eye on the ship. Because the captain may call at any moment, and when he does, you drop everything and run back, without looking behind you for your trinkets. Your family, your possessions, even your own body, these are like the shell on the beach. Good to have, good to enjoy, but never, ever the main cargo of your life. The main cargo is the part of you no one can confiscate. This is the first weapon you need to understand if you intend to become a man nothing can break. There is a portion of you that is permanently, structurally outside the reach of other people's cruelty. Your circumstances are not that portion. Your reputation is not that portion. Your comfort is not that portion. Your judgment is. And once you locate that part of yourself, once you actually find it, rather than just hearing about it, you will notice something strange happen. The threats that used to feel like death start to feel like weather. Annoying, sometimes painful, but never, structurally, capable of reaching the part of you that matters. If this idea is doing something to your chest right now, that feeling of a door opening somewhere you didn't know existed, that is exactly why this channel exists. Inner Steel is built for the version of you that's looking for that door. Subscribe, because we are about to go 9 layers deeper. The second man you need to understand was not enslaved by another person. He was enslaved by his own body, and by an empire's worth of expectation pressing down on him every single day. Marcus Aurelius became emperor of Rome in the year 161, inheriting an empire stretched to its limits, wars on the eastern frontier with Parthia, the Marcomanni and other Germanic tribes pressing on the Danube, and eventually, a plague, likely smallpox, that historians estimate may have killed a significant portion of the empire's population over the following years. He did not ask to rule during a catastrophe. He had been groomed for power since boyhood, handpicked by the Emperor Hadrian's chain of successors, trained in philosophy by tutors like Junius Rusticus who introduced him to Epictetus's teachings. And by most accounts he would have preferred a quiet life of study. Instead, history handed him roughly 2 decades of nearly uninterrupted military and biological crisis, with the fate of millions resting on decisions he had to make in the field, often while physically ill himself. Ancient sources describe him as having a frail constitution, possibly suffering from chest or stomach ailments for much of his adult life. He spent years away from Rome, camped near the frozen Danube frontier, commanding legions against tribal confederations in brutal, grinding campaigns that produced no clean victories, only attrition. At night, in his tent, by candlelight, exhausted from a day of command and likely in physical pain, he wrote to himself. Not for an audience. Not for publication. He was writing private reminders, arguments with his own mind, instructions to himself on how not to become cruel, how not to become bitter, how not to let the crushing weight of an empire turn him into the kind of tyrant his predecessors had sometimes been. Those notebooks survived. We call them meditations today, and they are, without exaggeration, one of the most studied texts in the history of leadership, written by a man who never intended a single line of it to be read by anyone else. In those pages, Marcus returns again and again to a single, hammering idea, that obstacles are not the opposite of your purpose, they are the material your purpose is made from. He wrote that the impediment to action advances action, that what stands in the way becomes the way. Think about the position this man was actually in when he wrote that. He was not a motivational speaker theorizing about hardship from comfort. He was commanding freezing, disease-ravaged legions on a hostile frontier, receiving reports of plague deaths in the capital he could not personally manage, almost certainly aware that the empire could fracture under him at any moment, and his conclusion, His actual operating philosophy under that pressure was that the obstacle itself was the workout, not a distraction from his purpose as emperor. The very substance of it. There's a passage where he reminds himself that a person who has no standard to refer their own mind to at every turn, and in all things, cannot be a philosopher, that everything happens as it should, and if you watch closely enough you'll find this true. Even the plague, even the war, even the betrayal of allies, folded into a larger order he had to trust even when he couldn't see the shape of it from inside the tent. This was not naive optimism. This was a war general telling himself, line by line, night after night, do not let this break the part of you that has to keep deciding wisely tomorrow. Wisely tomorrow. Notice also what Marcus did not do with those notebooks. He did not write them as a record of his accomplishments, the way a man secure in his own legend might. He did not write them to be quoted by future centuries, though they have been, endlessly. He wrote them as corrections. Reminders to a man who kept forgetting his own principles under pressure, who needed to tell himself, repeatedly, not to be dragged off course by the very people and events he was duty-bound to manage. That repetition is the part most people skip over when they admire the famous lines. He did not arrive at unshakable composure once and keep it forever. He had to rebuild it, in writing, by candlelight, after exhausting days over and over for years, because the pressure of the position kept trying to erode it faster than he could shore it back up. The strength was not a permanent possession he earned early and then coasted on. It was a maintenance project, conducted nightly, for the length of an empire's crisis. Marcus Aurelius died in the year 180, likely from the very plague he'd spent years governing through, in a military camp, still on campaign, still working. He never got his quiet life of study. He got 2 decades of crisis instead, and what he built in that crisis, not despite it, from inside it, became more valuable to more people across more centuries than almost any peacetime treatise. The obstacle was the way. He proved it with his whole life, not just his journal. There is something in you right now deciding whether your current obstacle is in your way or is your way. Inner steel exists to help you make that call correctly, every single time, so if Marcus's tent, his plague, his frontier are landing with you, hit subscribe before we go further, because the next man took this same principle into literal darkness. His name was Viktor Frankl, and what happened to him should have been enough to break any human mind permanently. Frankl was a Viennese psychiatrist, already an established voice in his field, when the machinery of the Nazi regime came for his entire life. In 1942, he and his wife and his parents were deported. He would eventually be moved through multiple camps, including Auschwitz and later Turkeyum, a subcamp of Dachau. His father died of starvation and disease in a different camp. His mother was killed at Auschwitz. His brother died. His wife, Tilly, died at Bergen-Belsen. By the time the camps were liberated in 1945, Frankl had lost nearly everyone in his family to systematic murder, had been stripped of his profession, his possessions, his name, replaced with a number tattooed onto his arm, and had spent years in conditions engineered specifically to extinguish the human spirit through starvation, exposure, and arbitrary violence. He watched men around him die not just from disease or beatings, but from something else, a kind of psychological collapse where a prisoner would simply give up, stop getting out of the bunk, stop eating what little there was, and die within days, sometimes with no new physical cause at all. He became obsessed, even inside the camp, with a clinical question: why do some men survive this, psychologically intact, while other men with similar physical conditions simply disintegrate? What is the actual variable? His answer, which he would spend the rest of his life refining into a body of work and a school of psychotherapy called logotherapy, was meaning. Not comfort. Not the absence of suffering. Suffering was, in the camps, unavoidable and universal. The variable was whether a man could locate some reason, some future point, some person or purpose that made his continued existence matter to him, even while suffering was happening. Frankl noticed that prisoners who held onto a specific image, a wife to return to, unfinished work, a child somewhere outside the wire, tended to survive longer and with more psychological coherence than men who could find no such anchor. He himself, by his own account, held on to the manuscript of a book he had been working on before his arrest, one the Nazis confiscated, and he spent part of his captivity mentally reconstructing it, planning to rewrite it if he lived. That single act of imagined future purpose, he believed, helped keep something in him intact while everything external was being destroyed. After liberation, having lost almost his entire family to the very system he survived, Frankl wrote a short book in the span of about 9 days, dictating much of it, called Man's Search for Meaning. In it, he wrote one of the most quietly devastating and clarifying sentences ever produced by a human being who had earned the right to say it. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. He was not theorizing. He had watched men in the bunks next to him lose that freedom and die from the loss of it, and he had watched other men, starving just the same, freezing just the same, somehow keep it. This is the part most people skip past too quickly because it sounds like a slogan. It is not a slogan. It is a clinical observation made by a trained psychiatrist who watched it function as a literal survival variable in the most controlled demonstration of human suffering the 20th century produced. The body can be starved. The family can be murdered. The name can be replaced with a number. And there is still, even there, a freedom that cannot be physically extracted from a human being. The freedom to decide what your suffering means and what you will do with the time you have left inside it. If you are carrying something right now that feels like it has taken everything from you, I want you to sit with Frankl's sentence for a moment longer than you normally would scroll past anything. And if it's doing what it's supposed to do, subscribe to Inner Steel, because this channel is built entirely on the belief that this exact freedom is available to you too, no matter what your version of the camp looks like. Now we go to ice. Actual, literal, Antarctic ice, and a man whose entire crew should have died, and somehow did not. In 1914, Ernest Shackleton set out on the ship Endurance with 27 men, attempting to be the first expedition to cross the Antarctic continent on foot. They never got the chance. By January 1915, the Endurance became trapped in pack ice in the Weddell Sea, frozen solid, unable to move forward or back. For 10 months, the ship sat crushed in the grip of the ice, drifting wherever the frozen sea decided to take it, until in October 1915 the pressure of the ice finally broke the ship's hull and it began to sink. Shackleton and his crew were forced to abandon ship and camp directly on the ice floes themselves, floating platforms of frozen ocean, with the freezing water of the Antarctic directly beneath their feet, thousands of miles from any rescue, with no radio capable of reaching the outside world, and no one on Earth aware they were even in danger. Read that again. 28 men. No ship. No way to call for help. Living on top of literally floating ice in one of the most hostile environments on the planet, with food running out and winter coming. By every reasonable measure, this expedition should be remembered as a tragedy, a footnote about men who froze and starved to death in the Antarctic in 1915 because of an arrogant attempt at exploration. That is not what happened, and the reason it didn't happen is almost entirely attributable to the character of one man. Shackleton made a decision early in the crisis that historians and leadership scholars still study. The expedition's stated goal, crossing the continent, was now completely irrelevant. The only goal that mattered was bringing every single man home alive. He reorganized the entire psychology of the camp around this. He made sure the weakest and most pessimistic men bunked near him personally, so he could manage their morale directly rather than letting despair spread unsupervised through the camp. He maintained rigid daily routines, meals at set times, watches, small rituals, specifically because he understood that structure is one of the only defenses against the kind of psychological collapse that kills men in extreme environments faster than the cold does. He understood something that most leaders under pressure never learn. Morale is not a feeling that happens to a group, it is a resource that has to be actively managed, person by person, the same way you'd manage food or fuel. He watched which men's spirits were sagging and redistributed his own attention toward them deliberately, the same way he redistributed rations. This was not warmth for its own sake. It was a calculated act of leadership, performed daily, under conditions that gave him every excuse to focus only on his own survival instead. When the ice floe they were camped on eventually began to break apart beneath them, he ordered the men into 3 small lifeboats they'd salvaged from the Endurance, and after days of brutal rowing through freezing, shark and leopard seal-infested waters, they reached the barren, uninhabited rocks of Elephant Island, solid ground, but essentially a death sentence, since no ship would ever think to look for them there. So Shackleton did something almost unthinkable. He selected 5 men and set out in a modified lifeboat, the James Caird, for a journey of roughly 800 nautical miles across some of the most violent ocean on Earth, navigating with nothing but a sextant and dead reckoning, aiming for a tiny speck of an island called South Georgia that they could miss entirely and never know it. They survived 16 days of nearly continuous storms, hurricane-force winds, and waves so cold that ice formed on the rigging, weighing the small boat down toward capsizing. They made landfall on the wrong side of South Georgia, separated from the whaling station that could help them by a mountain range no one had ever crossed. Shackleton and 2 others then crossed that uncharted, glaciated mountain range on foot, with improvised equipment, in roughly 36 hours, because stopping to rest risked freezing to death. He reached the whaling station. He organized a rescue. And every single one of the 28 men who had been stranded on the ice in 1915 was alive when it was over. Every one. In an expedition defined entirely by catastrophic failure of the original mission, the actual mission, the one Shackleton redefined the moment the ship sank, was a complete and total success. What Shackleton understood, and what every man watching this needs to take directly into his own life, is that you are allowed to abandon the goal without abandoning the standard. The continent crossing died with the ship. The commitment to bringing every man home alive never wavered for one single day on the ice. Sometimes nothing can break you, not because you refuse to ever change your plan, but because you know exactly which part of the plan is actually the mission and which part was just the shell on the beach. That distinction, knowing what you can let go of and what you will never let go of, is the entire difference between adapting and collapsing. If that distinction just clicked into place for you, that's inner steel doing its job. Subscribe now, because the next story is about a woman who made one decision, on one evening, that the entire system around her was not designed to survive. Her name was Rosa Parks, and the story most people know about her is incomplete in a way that actually weakens the lesson, so let's correct it. The popular version says a tired seamstress, worn out after a long day of work, spontaneously refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus on December 1, 1955, and that her tiredness made her brave enough to refuse. The truth is more important than that, and more useful to you. Rosa Parks was not simply a tired woman who snapped. She was, by that point, the secretary of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP, deeply involved in organizing against racial injustice for years already, and had personally trained in nonviolent resistance at the Highlander Folk School earlier that same year. When she refused to give up her seat to a white passenger, she was tired, by her own account, tired of giving in. That is a different kind of tired. Not physical exhaustion alone. Moral exhaustion, built over years of small surrenders, arriving at a point where one more surrender became impossible. Understand what she was actually risking in that moment. This was Alabama in 1955, under Jim Crow segregation, where Black Americans faced not just social humiliation but real, documented, lethal violence for defying the racial order, arrest, beatings, and in the worst cases, murder, often with no meaningful legal consequence for the perpetrators. Refusing a bus driver's order in that environment was not a symbolic inconvenience. It was a decision made with the genuine possibility of violent retaliation sitting in the room. She was arrested that evening, fingerprinted, and charged. What happened next is the part that should change how you think about pressure entirely. Her arrest became the spark for the Montgomery bus boycott, a sustained, organized refusal by the Black community of Montgomery to ride the city's buses, lasting 381 days, more than a full year, sustained through actual physical hardship, since many of the boycotters depended on those buses to get to work and instead walked miles, organized elaborate carpool networks, and endured economic retaliation and harassment for over a year, in order to make a single point register: we will not fund our own humiliation any longer. Rosa Parks herself lost her job over the arrest and the publicity. She and her husband eventually had to leave Montgomery entirely due to ongoing threats and economic retaliation. The boycott succeeded. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled Alabama's bus segregation laws unconstitutional, but Parks personally paid an enormous, sustained price for the moment that triggered it, far beyond that single evening. Here is the principle buried inside her decision that most retellings flatten out. She did not win because she was the loudest, or the angriest, or the most aggressive person on that bus. She won because she had reached a place inside herself, built through years of quiet preparation, training, and organizing most people never saw, where a specific line had become non-negotiable, and she simply, calmly, declined to move past it. No raised voice. No dramatic speech. Just an immovable internal position meeting an external demand, and the internal position did not budge. This is what real unbreakability looks like in practice far more often than people expect. It is rarely loud. It is rarely a single moment of inspired courage that arrives from nowhere. It is the product of years of quiet internal preparation arriving at a moment where the prepared person simply does not move, while everyone watching assumes the moment itself created the strength. The moment did not create Rosa Parks' strength. The moment revealed strength that had already been built, slowly, over years, mostly in rooms nobody was filming. You are building your own version of that immovable line right now, today, in choices nobody is watching. That is exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous work Inner Steel is here to help you do consistently. So if this resonates, make sure you're subscribed, because the next man's story shows you what happens when that immovable line gets tested for 27 straight years. Nelson Mandela was arrested in 1962 and would not walk free again until February 1990. 27 years, much of it spent on Robben Island, a prison built on an isolated island off the coast of Cape Town specifically designed to be brutal and isolating, where political prisoners were subjected to hard labor, often breaking rocks in a lime quarry under harsh sun that would, over years, damage many prisoners' eyesight, including Mandela's own. 27 years. Sit with the actual scale of that number for a moment, because it is easy to say and almost impossible to actually absorb. A man in his mid-40s, already a trained lawyer and a leader of the African National Congress's resistance against apartheid, was taken from his life, his young family, his unfinished work, and put into a small cell, doing manual labor, for a span of time longer than many people's entire adult careers. His own children grew from young kids into adults he had to meet again as near strangers. His mother died while he was imprisoned. His eldest son died in a car accident while he was imprisoned, and the apartheid government denied him permission to attend the funeral. He received this news in a small cell on an island, with no ability to go comfort his own family, no ability to grieve in the way a free man would be allowed to grieve. The South African government periodically offered him conditional release throughout his imprisonment, offers that would have required him to renounce the armed resistance struggle and accept restrictions on his political activity. He refused these offers. Repeatedly. Sitting in a small cell, having already lost decades of his life and members of his own family to this imprisonment, with a clear path to physical freedom sitting directly in front of him, he calculated that accepting a compromised freedom would betray the actual mission he had given his life to, and he chose to remain in that cell rather than become a free man with a hollowed-out cause. When he finally was released in February 1990, after F.W. de Klerk's government began dismantling apartheid, the man who walked out was not a broken, bitter shell, which is what almost any reasonable person would have predicted after 27 years of exactly this treatment. He emerged and became a central architect of a negotiated, largely peaceful transition away from apartheid rule, and in 1994 became South Africa's first democratically elected president in the country's first fully representative elections. He then made a decision that genuinely stunned much of the world. Rather than using his new power for retribution against the system and the individuals who had stolen nearly 3 decades of his life, he established and championed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, prioritizing national healing and a shared future over personal vengeance, he would have been entirely justified, by any normal human standard, in seeking. How does a human mind survive 27 years of exactly this kind of sustained, deliberate cruelty, and come out the other side still capable of reconciliation rather than consumed by an entirely understandable hatred? Mandela himself offered an answer that should be carved somewhere. You see it daily. He said that resentment is like drinking poison and then hoping it will kill your enemies. He understood, apparently from somewhere very deep and very deliberately cultivated, that the bitterness he had every right to feel would not punish the men who imprisoned him. It would only continue their work for them, finishing the job of breaking him long after they'd lost the legal power to keep him locked up. He made a choice, repeated daily for nearly 3 decades in a small cell, to keep some portion of himself reserved for the future he intended to build rather than spending all of it on rage at the past that had been forced on him. That is not passivity. That is one of the most disciplined acts of psychological self-preservation in modern history, sustained not for a week, not for a year, but for 27 consecutive years. If you are holding on to resentment towards something or someone right now, ask yourself honestly whether it is protecting you or whether it is, quietly, continuing the work of whoever hurt you in the first place. That single question is the kind of thing this channel exists to put in front of you, so if it landed, subscribe to Inner Steel, because the next man's test came not from a government, but from his own country, after he gave everything for it. James Stockdale was a United States Navy pilot shot down over North Vietnam in September 1965. He was captured and held as a prisoner of war for over 7 years, much of it at the prison camp American POWs grimly nicknamed the Hanoi Hilton, where he endured repeated torture, extended solitary confinement, and was kept in leg irons for roughly 2 years as punishment for his continued resistance and leadership among the other prisoners. As the senior-ranking officer among the captured Americans for much of his imprisonment, he organized a secret internal code of conduct among the prisoners specifically to help them resist propaganda and torture as a unified group rather than as isolated, breakable individuals. At one point reportedly injuring himself severely rather than allow himself to be used as a propaganda exhibit for the North Vietnamese, understanding that his value as a senior officer made him a specific target for exploitation, and removing that value at enormous personal cost. Stockdale survived this for more than 7 years and was released in 1973. What he said afterward, in interviews and later in his own writing, became one of the most quoted and most frequently misunderstood pieces of wisdom about resilience in modern leadership literature. He was asked, essentially, who didn't make it out, psychologically, even among those who survived physically. And his answer surprised people. It wasn't the pessimists who broke fastest, though you'd expect that. It was, he said, the optimists, specifically, the ones who kept insisting they'd be home by a specific date, Christmas, then Easter, then the 4th of July, and then watched that date pass, again and again, year after year, until the repeated disappointment itself became what broke them. The survivors, Stockdale explained, were the men who held what later came to be called the Stockdale paradox, an unwavering faith that they would ultimately prevail in the end, combined with a brutal, clear-eyed acceptance of the actual facts of their present situation, however severe. Not blind optimism that ignored the torture and the years passing. Not despair that surrendered to it. Something harder to hold than either. Total honesty about how bad things actually were right now, fused permanently with total certainty that it would not be the final chapter. This is one of the most operationally useful ideas in this entire script, so do not let it pass by as just another quote. Most people collapse into one of 2 failure modes under real pressure. Either they lie to themselves about how bad things are, manufacturing a fragile optimism that shatters every time reality disagrees with the fantasy. Christmas comes, you're still in the cell, the fragile hope breaks something real inside you. Or they accept how bad things are so completely that they let the present moment's severity convince them the future is already decided too, and they stop fighting for an outcome they've prematurely written off. Stockdale's 7 years in that camp are proof that there is a third position, and that it is the only one that survives extended, severe pressure intact. See the floor exactly as it is, with no flinching and no decoration, and simultaneously refuse to let that floor define the ceiling. This is not a passive mental trick you stumble into by accident. Stockdale had to actively defend this position daily, against two different pulls trying to drag him off it from opposite directions. The torture and the isolation were constantly pulling him toward despair, toward the conclusion that the facts were so brutal that hope itself was a kind of lie. And the natural human instinct to self-soothe was constantly pulling him toward manufactured certainty about dates and outcomes he had no actual control over. Holding the paradox meant refusing both pulls simultaneously, every single day, for over 7 years, without the relief of ever fully picking a side. That is an exhausting position to hold. It is also, by his own direct testimony, the only position that did not eventually break the men who held it. That is not optimism. That is something sturdier than optimism. It's a discipline you can actually train, starting with how honestly you assess your current Tuesday compared to how honestly you assess your eventual outcome. If you've ever caught yourself setting a fake deadline for your own pain just to survive the week, by next month this will be better, and then breaking a little when that date passed anyway, Stockdale's paradox is the fix. An inner steel exists to keep handing you fixes like this one. Subscribe now, because the eighth man took a single 60-second event and made it the engine of an entire later life. David Goggins was, by his own extensively documented account, a deeply unpromising young man. He grew up in a household marked by his father's documented physical abuse toward him, his brother, and his mother, an environment of fear that they eventually escaped when his mother fled with the children in the middle of the night. He struggled severely with stuttering as a child, struggled academically, and by his own description was overweight, working an exterminator job, with what looked from the outside like a life that had quietly settled into mediocrity. Not a tragedy exactly, just a slow, comfortable drift toward nothing in particular. Then, in his early 20s, he saw a television segment about Navy SEALs and became fixated on the idea of becoming one himself, despite having essentially none of the physical qualifications for it at that moment in his life. He applied and was told point blank that he weighed nearly 300 pounds and that this would never happen for him. Instead of accepting that as the final word, he gave himself an absurdly short window, by his own account, roughly 3 months, to lose close to 100 pounds and qualify for the physical screening test. He did it through what he has since described as a relentless, almost obsessive program of swimming, running, and caloric restriction, qualifying with what he describes as very little margin to spare. He went on to attempt Navy SEAL training, known as BD/S, multiple separate times, because he was forced to medically drop out partway through more than once due to injuries including pneumonia and a heart condition discovered during training. Most people who fail out of the most physically and psychologically punishing military training program in the country once never attempted again. Goggins went back. Multiple times. He eventually completed it, becoming a Navy SEAL, and later went on to also complete Army Ranger School, graduating as Distinguished Honor Graduate, and Air Force Tactical Air Controller training, becoming, by widely cited accounts, one of a very small number of individuals to complete all 3 of the U.S. military's most demanding combat training pipelines. What Goggins has built his entire later public message around, in his book Can't Hurt Me and in years of subsequent interviews, is a concept he calls the 40% rule, the observation, from his own brutal personal testing during ultra-endurance races and SEAL training, that when the mind tells the body it is completely finished, totally maxed out, unable to continue one more step, the body in actual physiological reality has typically used somewhere around 40% of its real capacity. The other 60%, he argues, is sitting there the entire time, locked behind a mental governor most people never learn to override, mistaking the discomfort of that governor activating for the discomfort of an actual physical limit. He talks about keeping what he calls a cookie jar, a mental inventory of every previous moment in his life where he proved to himself he could survive something that felt unsurvivable at the time, that he could reach into during a new crisis as evidence, real evidence drawn from his own lived history, that the current unbearable moment was, statistically, very likely bearable too, because the previous ones had been. The specific value of Goggins' story for you is not really the extreme physical feats themselves, impressive as they are. It's the underlying mechanism he discovered and then deliberately, repeatedly, almost scientifically tested on himself, the wall you hit is, overwhelmingly, a mental wall wearing a physical costume, and the only way to find out how much further you actually have is to keep moving after the part of your brain screaming to stop has already cast its vote, and then noticing, afterward, that you're still standing. What makes this useful instead of just impressive is that Goggins did not discover the 40% rule once, and then live the rest of his life on the strength of that single insight. He has described testing it again and again, in different events, against different versions of his own resistance, because the mind does not stay convinced. It relitigates the same argument every single time the body gets uncomfortable, as if no prior evidence exists. That means the skill is not learned once. It is re-earned, deliberately, every time the wall shows up again wearing a slightly different costume. Every time you stop the instant it gets uncomfortable, you are reinforcing the lie that the discomfort is the actual ceiling. Every time you push slightly past it and survive, you are making a small, real deposit into your own cookie jar, building the same kind of evidence Goggins spent years accumulating about himself. That's not motivational language. That is a trainable skill, and it compounds. If you want help training it, you already know what to do. Subscribe to Inner Steel, because the final man in this script did something that scientists, for decades, said was a flat biological impossibility. For years, the 4-minute mile was considered not just a difficult athletic target, but a genuine, hard biological ceiling. Physiologists and sports scientists of the era seriously argued that the human heart, lungs, and skeletal structure were simply not built to sustain that pace for a full mile, and that attempting it carried real medical risk. This was not a fringe opinion. It was something close to scientific consensus for a very long time, repeated in respected publications, treated as settled physiological fact rather than an unbroken record waiting to fall. Roger Bannister was a 25-year-old British medical student, training for the mile around his demanding studies, with nothing close to the dedicated full-time training regimens that elite runners use today. On May 6, 1954, at a track in Oxford, in cold and windy conditions that were, if anything, less than ideal for a record attempt, with the help of 2 training partners serving as pacers, Bannister ran the mile in 3 minutes, 59.4 seconds. He broke the supposedly unbreakable barrier by 0.6 of a second, becoming the first human being recorded doing what an entire scientific establishment had insisted, with real expertise and real data behind the claim, could not be done. Here is the detail that matters more than the race itself, more than the time, more than the medical student detail, more than any of it. Bannister's record stood for only 46 days. On June 21, 1954, an Australian runner named John Landy ran the mile even faster. And in the years that followed, the 4-minute mile, once treated as a hard ceiling on human physiology itself, became a standard benchmark that serious competitive milers were expected to beat regularly. The barrier had never actually been a wall built into the structure of human biology. It had been a wall built into the structure of human belief about human biology, and the instant one man's mind and body proved that belief wrong, dozens of other men's minds and bodies, who had been training under the exact same supposed ceiling the whole time, simply followed him through the gap he made. This is the final piece you need, and it reframes every story that came before it in this script. The slave's chains, the emperor's plague, the camp starvation, the ice floe, the bus, the prison cell, the torture cell, the exterminator's body, every obstacle and every story you've just heard functioned, to some degree, the way the 4-minute mile functioned for an entire generation of runners. Not as an actual hard limit of what a human being's mind and spirit can sustain, but as a belief about that limit, one that becomes self-confirming for everyone who has never personally watched someone break through it. Bannister did not just run a fast mile. He destroyed a belief that had been functioning as a real, physiologically enforced ceiling for the entire world of competitive running, and the moment the belief died, the actual physical limit it had been disguised as turned out to have never really existed in the first place. You are very likely operating right now under at least one belief about your own limits that has exactly the same structure as the 4-minute mile, unexamined, treated as settled fact, repeated by people around you with real confidence, and entirely, completely false the moment someone with your exact starting conditions decides to test it properly instead of accepting it. 9 people. A slave whose body was owned but whose judgment never was. An emperor who turned a plague-ravaged frontier into a private seminar on character. A psychiatrist who watched meaning function as a literal survival mechanism inside the worst place humans have built for other humans. A captain who redefined the mission the instant the ship sank and brought every man home anyway. A woman whose quiet, years-long preparation made one calm refusal unstoppable. A president who chose reconciliation over poison after 27 years that would have justified any amount of rage. A pilot who held 2 opposite truths at once for over 7 years in a cell and let neither one cancel the other out. A man who turned his own body into proof that the wall quitting builds is almost always fake. And a medical student who didn't break a record so much as he broke a belief, and discovered the wall behind it had never been load-bearing in the first place. None of them were unbreakable because nothing painful ever touched them. Every single one of them was touched by something that should have ended them completely, by any reasonable measure you'd applied beforehand. What made them unbreakable was something internal, something none of their captors, illnesses, storms, governments, or scientific consensuses could physically reach, the part of the self that decides what an event means, and what you intend to do with the time you have left inside it. That part was never up for negotiation with their circumstances. It still isn't up for negotiation with yours. Whatever you are carrying right now, and you know exactly what it is, you knew before you clicked on this, it is not asking you to feel nothing. None of these 9 men and women felt nothing. Epictetus did not pretend his leg didn't hurt. Frankl did not pretend his family was still alive. Mandela did not pretend 27 years had not been stolen from him. The strength was never the absence of pain. It was the refusal to let the pain make the final decision about what came next. That is the part almost every retelling of these stories gets slightly wrong, and it is the part you need most. Because if you go looking for a version of strength that feels like nothing, you will conclude you don't have it the first time something actually hurts. You do have it. It simply coexists with the hurt instead of replacing it. It is asking you to locate the one part of you that the situation, whatever it is, cannot actually touch unless you hand it over voluntarily. Find that part. Stand on it. Decide, today, what this chapter is going to mean, rather than waiting to find out what it means to you by default, the way most people do, only to discover years later that they let the worst version of the story write itself while they were too busy surviving to notice. Nothing can break you. Not because nothing will ever hit you. Something will. Something already has. But there is a place in you these 9 people proved exists in every single human being who chooses to find it, and once you find yours, you carry it into every version of the ice, the cell, the camp, and the mile that life still has waiting for you. If this is the kind of thing you need to hear again, on a hard morning, on a hard year, subscribe to Inner Steel right now, because this is exactly what we build, and we are not done building it with you.